morning, everyone. Wonderful. Thank you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and get myself situated. Can everybody hopefully see and hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Hope that's looking good. Thank you. Appreciate that. Awesome. Well, it's wonderful to be with you all today. My name is Dr. Whitney Standel Scholars. My pronouns are she, her. And today I will be talking with you all about breaking the silence about sex, how to talk to our clients about sex, sexual health, and sexual concerns. A couple of things I would love to share if anyone that is joining that maybe has visual impairments. I'd like to just give kind of a synopsis of what is happening. My name, like I said, is Whitney. I am a cisgender female of European American heritage. I have blonde hair. I'm joining from my home office in Salt Lake City and have a really nice plant joining me in my screen. So I hope that gives a nice little visual before we jump in. Right. So before we start, I do want to just share from an accuracy, utility, and risks standpoint. I worked really hard to make sure that this presentation aligns with all of the ethical standards that guide our kind of governing bodies for clinical practice, including the American Psychological Association, the National Association of Social Work, the American Counseling Association, and the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. So I worked hard to make sure that it aligned with the ethical standards provided by these organizations. I do want to note that because of the sensitive nature of sex-related topics, misuse of this information could result in us not practicing these ethical requirements. So I do ask that if you're utilizing this information, that we're mindful we're applying it in ethical and effective ways. Also, before we begin, I want you to know from program notices, I have no conflicts of interest or no commercial support for providing this presentation today. As I'm joining you all from Salt Lake City, I want to begin with a land acknowledgement that Utah is home to the indigenous peoples of the Ute, Paiute, Goshute, Shoshone, and Navajo nations, and honoring this as their indigenous land and their heritage. I also want to note that this conversation around sexual health, around wellness, is constantly changing as we're gathering more research and data. And so I want to acknowledge before I begin my fallibility in presenting this information, but also a commitment to continue to learn. And so I ask if I present information that you have questions about, or you feel like maybe isn't aligned with the most ethical practice or standard of care, I invite email feedback. I love to continue to learn how I can provide the most effective and supportive care for our clients. Also, throughout the presentation, I will have my sweet colleague Jennifer is going to be helping me with noticing questions that come in the chat. Please feel free to put those in there and I will do my very best to respond. My intent for today is to provide a 2-hour lecture and then have some time for question and answers at the end. That is optional for folks to attend. So either questions in the chat, you can save your questions for the end, or you're welcome to email me as well. I do want you to know that any clients or case examples that I will use throughout my presentation, I'm going to work really hard to de-identify aspects of their identities to make sure that I maintain their confidentiality. And before we jump in, I guess I just asked that you please reduce distractions, turn off anything that might have a notification go off, and if you can, try to engage yourself in the material. With that being said, I also ask that you grab either a notebook or something that you would be able to jot thoughts down. I have a couple activities throughout my lecture that I'd love for you to have some self-exploration or maybe jot a note that you can think about later. So if you can take a second to grab a notebook or something that you could jot notes on, I think that would be for your benefit. Wonderful. So like I said, my name is Dr. Whitney Standel Scholars. I go by she, her pronouns, and I often just go by Dr. Whit to my clients. I know you got a chance to learn a little bit about me maybe in signing up for this presentation, so I won't belabor it, but I guess I want you to know just kind of serendipitously and intentionally, I received training around sexual health and concerns really across the lifespan with having conversations with parents as they're navigating sexual development with their young children, all the way to supporting older individuals later in life as they're navigating maybe mental decline amidst sexual health care. So kind of across that spectrum, I've had the benefit and pleasure of learning how to support clients. And I really hope I can provide information today that is applicable to all your practice and is something you can really implement promptly. Another thing I just want to say is I'm so grateful for my supervisors who have supported my clinical training, who I've listed here, who've just been a really important part of my learning in regards to these topics. And I also want to thank Jen Van Gorp, who is our marketing and outreach coordinator for UCEB2, who really is kind of the brains behind any of these CE events happening. So thank you, Jen. Bless you for that. And my learning statement for this presentation today is threefold. I want to increase just general knowledge base on how to approach conversations about sex in therapy and just increase our confidence in doing that. I also want to provide really, really practical examples, models, templates, and strategies for how you can initiate these conversations and kind of weave it into your work. I will include a lot of QR codes throughout my presentation with the intent that you can hold up your camera on your phone and scan it, and it'll take you directly to that resource or that PDF. So hopefully it can just be really accessible. And I also want to provide a lot of resources for further learning. I will, at the end of this presentation, within the next week or two, you'll get a copy of all my slides. It will include all of the resources, all of my references, and I'll also make sure I include a slide that links our website that has a lot of resources as well. Our agenda is we're going to just start initially by talking about why is this an important topic? What does this mean for us? And then we're going to talk a little bit more about templates and models, some practical strategies, and then some specific population consideration and resources. Okay, so as we get started, I'd love for us to just do kind of a clinician check-in here. And check in and ask ourselves, how often are we currently discussing sex, sexual health, and/or sexual concerns with our clients? So I'm actually going to go ahead and pull up a poll for us. Give me one moment here. You can take a moment to respond, and this is an intent, and it's not an intent to be critical, but to really just invite us to be honest. Give us a little bit longer for folks to jump in. Just beginning to check in. How often am I currently discussing sex, sexual health, and/or sexual concerns with my clients? All right. Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end our poll here, and then we can see the results together. So it looks like we have kind of some variability, right? Some folks are like, yep, this is part of my practice, and others are kind of maybe in that space where it's not a regular part of our conversation. And I just want to say I'm really grateful that you're here, and I hope this can feel like really practical information for how you can really just graciously and easily invite this in. Excellent. Thank you for your willingness. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll down for us. So this is a good just checkpoint. Okay, noticing how often we bring these topics up. And I guess that would be kind of my invitation is like, as we go through this presentation, is how willing am I to practice increasing my comfortability talking with clients about sex and sexual health? And so that might be a good point just to kind of check in and notice if there's any barriers or difficulties with approaching the subject for you. I do want to include this really great resource from Doug Braun-Harvey, he's a wonderful sexual health educator and has this great scale that he adapted from Harrison Hayes. It's called the Comfort and Willingness Scale. Included the QR code here. You're welcome to pull up your phone and scan that and hold on to that. It's a great, more in-depth way that as a clinician, we can kind of check in on our willingness to have these conversations. A couple other questions I'd love for you to just think about. You can either jot this down on that notebook I asked you to have available and also maybe to loop back after the presentation and just notice, like, what stereotypes do I hold about sex, and how do I think maybe my values and beliefs about sex might differ from my clients. Just good self exploration to inform our capacity to loop in these conversations with our clients. All right, so why, like why do we do this? Why is this important? I kind of think there's like there's lots of reasons why, but I kind of think there's like three main reasons why it's so important that we make an effort to loop in these conversations with our clients. One is, I just think from a mental health care standpoint. Secondly, relationally, the role of therapy is such a unique role that we have to be a part of people's lives in a really intimate way. And kind of the reasoning I have is, like, if it's not going to be in that room, like where else? Like where else are we going to have these conversations? We'll talk more about that. And then third, I also think it aligns with broader goals for more holistic and affirming care as individuals' interactions with their sexuality and their sexual health really inform a lot of other areas of their life, especially intersecting identities for marginalized communities. And so it really aligns with that broader goal. So specifically to mental health care, I mean, we just know that sexuality is such an important aspect of our physical, our mental, and our relational health for ourselves as well as for our clients. And so the way I kind of see it is like, man, if our goal as a clinician is to really provide holistic care, we're assessing about, medical concerns, we're assessing around their relational health, we're assessing around mental health concerns. Sexuality is a really key component of that. And I think just from another point too is that sexual concerns can either be the result of other mental health concerns or even physical illnesses. I also have seen mental health concerns come up as a response to sexual dysfunction or sexual concerns. For example, one of my very first clients I provided kind of sexual care with was an individual in a medical setting in his late 60s who was navigating diabetes, and it really impacted his erectile functioning. And so this conversation of the sexual dysfunction was secondary to a medical concern. Whereas for other individuals, perhaps navigating depression or maybe even use of an SSRI or other medication to treat a mental health can also cause impacts to our sexual functioning. Another example would be perhaps even maybe someone initiating sexual contact with a loved one, with a partner, right? Like their inability to express themselves sexually might create symptoms of depression or anxiety. And so then the mental health concern is really secondary to a sexual health concern. So once again, just wanting to name it, it's really interconnected and so important that we're looping these in to the conversation. Within the therapeutic relationship, there's so much research, and I'll talk a lot more about this at our presentation today, is that clients are often really hesitant to initiate discussion around their health and wellness, especially around sexual health and wellness. And so it really is kind of an effort on our part of like initiating that conversation to help them feel more comfortable and safe that these are important concerns to bring into the therapeutic process. And so another component of that is I really appreciate this work from Dr. Stephanie Bueller, who writes a really wonderful book. It's like what every mental health care professional needs to know about sex. It's a wonderful reference. I encourage you to get it. She talks a lot about how there's often this expectation as clinicians that if we're not a specialized sex therapist, we're not able to answer any questions or any concerns around sexual functioning. Often the language I kind of hear is like, I don't work with sex. And on one hand, of course, we want to recognize our own ethical competence, what we feel like we can do. And there are situations where we need to consider referrals. But I also want to bring up the other end of that, whereas like if we're constantly kind of using that as a response, what we're communicating to our client is that this sort of shame dynamic, maybe even reinforcing this idea that like something is really horribly wrong with them. And I want us to just be sensitive of how that might land with the client. So an important clinical question is, when is this actually outside of my scope and I need to make a referral out of ethical obligation? Or is this just a conversation or intervention that I'm uncomfortable with, or I feel like I need more learning in, and that's the reason I'm wanting to refer them out? And so I guess I want us to just hold that in balance, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we can kind of move forward from there. If it's not discussed in the therapy room, then where will it be, right? We know that within medical systems, folks are being moved through appointments really quickly, and oftentimes the therapy room really is the most space and time that a person has to talk about these things. So I just want to invite that this is an important space to do that. All right. And then lastly, essentially, I feel like these bringing up sexual health really aligns with this broader goal for more inclusive, more holistic, and affirming care. I did include as a QR code here a reference to the World Association for Sexual Health. It is essentially their declaration of sexual rights, and it's a really beautiful read. I recommend that as a resource. So a couple things I'd like to share is that when we're bringing up a sexual health conversation, sexual concerns, it invites so much more attunement to intersecting identities. And this comes from a lot of the work of Kimberly Crenshaw around intersectionality, especially within BIPOC and other marginalized communities, where there's this intersection of multiple marginalized identities and how that impacts their mental health and physical health. And so, especially for more marginalized communities, whether that's race or ethnicity, LGBTQIA, and other minority populations, attunement to the sexual health conversation is really allowing us to be attentive to maybe where these aspects of their life kind of intersect, and attunement to how that might be unique to them. For example, a queer BIPOC individual's experience of sexuality is going to be different than a cishet male, right? And so that awareness of bringing in this conversation is helping us align with this scope of really nuancing each client's individual experience and providing hopefully that in an anti-racist and really affirming way. So a couple things I want to just note is that I'll talk a lot more about when we look through more specific populations and how we can address sexual health conversations. Just acknowledging, especially within the BIPOC community, there has been a lot of racist stereotypes, a lot of objectification around their sexuality. And so attunement to an awareness of Black racist stereotypes against BIPOC communities is really important as we're talking about sexual health, right? Especially for LGBTQIA individuals, initiating conversations around sexual health, sexual functioning is really pertinent, especially for supporting trans-affirming care, maybe WPATH letters, gender-affirming surgery. It's just this opportunity to really nuance and align and understand what their sexual and gender identity. Especially within religious and spiritual traditions, there's also, so many morals, values that individuals maybe want to nuance or keep, and others that they might want to shift. And it's a really important role as a clinician that we can be present with that as well. And I'll talk a bit more about working with that population specifically as well. And then also within like ability and disability, by initiating conversations around sexual health, we're challenging ableism, right? There's a myth, there is a stereotype that individuals who are navigating physical disabilities or chronic illness are not sexual people, and that is just simply false. And so by bringing this conversation up, we're challenging ableism, and we're also going to invite a really creative conversation with them about how they can engage with pleasure, maybe in more creative ways. So just a nice reminder that sexual rights are human rights, and another reason why this conversation is just so important. Okay, so what gets in the way? This is where I'd love if you're open to sharing in the chat, what do you feel like maybe gets in the way for initiating these conversations? It sounds like a lot of us identify that we don't bring up these conversations very regularly in our clinical practice. And so if you're willing to share, what gets in the way? I'd be curious to hear. And then we'll look at research as well. Yeah, I'm seeing individuals in the chat sharing client discomfort. Absolutely. Yeah, concern it will make clients uncomfortable, of course. Own discomfort, absolutely. Yeah, of course. I'm even thinking, what about fear of not having accurate information, right? Something, own discomfort, client discomfort, someone's noticing even gender dynamics. So providing or asking about this information to individuals of opposite gender or gender different than yours. Heteronormative ideas are more rigid about sex and shame. Of course, we're challenging these myths. Other more overt presenting concerns take up space. Of course, right? That hierarchy of like, what do we need to really be attending to in our clinical work? Client discomfort related to religious beliefs. Yeah, how do we make sense of moral and religious beliefs that often feel really contradictory to sexual conversations? Not sure where to take the conversation. Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm really appreciating all of y'all's engagement and sharing these examples. I feel like this is such a, there's so many reasons, right? And I hope from just a compassionate standpoint, we can acknowledge that there's so many reasons why this maybe doesn't pop up as our first conversation. And I hope more than anything, us just putting this in the chat, talking about it, we can acknowledge that like we're not alone. It comes up sometimes, these barriers, right? Thank you again for sharing. So I'd love to also share this some research by Olthoff and colleagues. Really, really interesting to see what was reported as barriers for clients bringing up this conversation, and then what were maybe barriers that clinicians or mental health providers reported as barriers. And what's really interesting to note is that this research specifically was multidisciplinary. So it was kind of, it was mental health providers, social workers, individuals working in hospital settings. It really was quite a spectrum. So it's not just within maybe counseling work, it is a bit broader within healthcare. And I guess I'm curious, as we look through this, I mean, it looks like for clients, one of the main reasons they felt like they couldn't bring it up or barriers to it is they felt like there was a lack of opportunity. I don't know about y'all, but when I read that, I was like, oh man, okay. Maybe like that's an invitation for us as a clinician to at least broach the subject, right? Shame, embarrassment, social taboo against talking about sex. Also, another high reason was doubt that even talking about it would really change or improve the outcome of the current concern or the situation. And so also another barrier clients noted was kind of uncertain if sex is a part of like a healthcare conversation, like if that's something they could bring in either to their primary care provider or their therapist. And then also kind of questions around just like which discipline really covers sexual and sexual concerns. And then for clinicians and healthcare providers, I do think it's so interesting that one of the big ones was like timing or restraints. Secondly was that unrealistic fear of how it maybe it would offend or land with the client. And another big one was our deficits in our own communication. And I would also include like maybe knowledge base in that as well. Yeah, and some other questions about treatment, not sure, know kind of what's best practice, not wanting to give bad advice, right? And especially this sort of discomfort with sex conversations when there's gender dynamics, perhaps when you're working with adolescents, or maybe when you're working with elderly populations. There's some population barriers perhaps that we feel a bit hesitant about. And the last one is like just feeling inadequate sexual health education. And there's a lot of research showing that for the most part, there is just not a standardized curriculum for how these conversations are taught within social work, marriage and family therapy, counseling, PsyD, all these different programs. It's just not really a good like standard of care. I'm curious as I share this slide, is there any, feel free to put in the chat, is there any of these barriers that maybe surprised you? I'm curious to hear. A clinician. Oh yeah, I'm loving, there's so many good comments from the previous question too. Thank you all. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if anything, just curious if anything surprised you. I think one of the ones for me was realizing like clients feeling like a lack of opportunity. I think I assumed the immediate response would be like I'm too uncomfortable to talk about it, but really feeling like maybe I wish there was an opportunity, but I'm just not sure how to breach it. Yeah, thank you. Some comments in the chat are sharing how these concerns feel really fair and there's not really surprise. Appreciate your honesty on that. Yeah. So I hope this is just affirming that there's a lot of reasons why it's difficult to initiate these conversations that are really valid. And I hope we can just kind of compassionately recognize these barriers and then decide how we want to move forward with that. Excellent. So I think kind of looping back, I feel like there's sort of this myth, right? I have to be a specialized sex therapist to talk to my clients about these concerns. And I actually really appreciate this is from a supervisor that I got a chance to work with. His name was Dr. Adam Fisher. And I'm so grateful that he kind of made this comment. He's like, you know what? Honestly, so much of sexual concerns is around like providing good psychoeducation, accurate information. Like that's the bulk of it. And and then there's like a little bit of work around some sex informed like interventions. And I want to say, okay, quick like pause blanket statement. This doesn't mean that is a template for every single sexual concern. It definitely depends on the impact it's having on the individual's life and functioning. But a lot of kind of common sexual concerns, maybe arousal difficulties, maybe there's arousal discrepancy between an individual and their partner. So someone is more interested in sex than the other individual. Difficulty with orgasm, maybe difficulty with vaginal pain, things like that. Maybe anxiety about just kind of sexual performance or kind of comfortability in their body with sexual behavior. Some of these more common sexual concerns, I would argue, are things we can address in therapy with just really good psychoeducation, accurate information, and some specialized interventions that I hope I can share with you. And of course, key point here too is that ethics and competence that sometimes we interact with individuals who are experiencing mental health concerns and sexual concerns that really do feel outside of our scope, that's maybe putting them at really high risk, safety, or someone information, giving them choice is hopefully normalizing really this broad spectrum of what it means to be a human expressing our sexuality and allowing that to not be so reinforced by shame. A huge piece as well is increasing our access to and engagement and pleasure. I appreciate this is from work and support from Dr. Michael Adams, who's another supervisor I had the pleasure of working with. And he talked about how so much of these conversations with clients is more about their relationship to pleasure. Is there maybe dynamics in their life that's made it difficult for them to believe that they're deserving of feeling at home in their bodies, feeling that they can have pleasure, enjoyment? And that's not just sexual, that's also non-sexual pleasure. And a lot of exploration around that relationship is really pertinent to this conversation. Another part of our role, of course, is inquiring, exploring, and seeking to understand our clients' values around sex and sexual health. I have to say, I think this is where it gets really tricky. Maybe if you lean a bit more progressive than your clients do, or maybe they're affiliated with a more high demand religion or religious or spiritual heritage that has more beliefs about sex and what we can do with that. It's tricky, it's difficult, but our role as a clinician is not to convince or persuade. It is to understand their experience and to try to find this way that we can successfully support them as a sexual being and as a religious being. And lastly, of course, assessing for risk and safety, making sure we're having conversations around reducing coercive behavior or abuse, that we're talking about contraceptive methods and ways that they can protect themselves from STIs. Important things. So what I've noticed from just kind of a brief literature review around sexual health and the kind of the person of the clinician, it sounds like a lot in like the 1980s, there was a lot more conversation around the awareness that as clinicians, we might get aroused talking about sex with our clients. And it sounds like it's kind of fallen off since then. So I have to admit, I need to do some more literature review on my own time to kind of get more updated information. But at least from the preliminary work I've done, just noticing that it's just part of a human experience to experience arousal when clients bring up these concerns. And it's important that we notice if that is arising for us. And that would be a really important time to loop in supervision, right? Talk with colleagues and make sure we're kind of balancing this like, oh, is this just a normal autonomic, response for me? Or am I maybe experiencing some countertransference reactions towards this client specifically? These are just important things for us to consider. I would say just because you're having conversations around sexual health with clients does not mean that you need to disclose aspects of your own sexuality or maybe what your preferences are. That is 100% up to you and your boundaries and what feels comfortable. And I think having that conversation with the client could even be a really important boundary to put in place and discuss. What we do know from research is that general just training and supports with a sense of increased comfort and confidence talking about these themes. So thank you for being here. And I hope I'm providing a lot of other resources that you can look at that will really help you feel like you have so many resources you can draw on to feel more comfortable initiating these conversations, the words you want to use, and kind of regulating and maintaining your own body as you're facilitating these conversations. Harrison Hayes has a really wonderful kind of template model for our own ability as a clinician to have comfortability with these conversations. They kind of outline it in these 4 steps. And the first is just self-examination. Am I noticing any barriers to me initiating these conversations? What makes it difficult for me? What are my sexual values? Are there myths or stereotypes that I hold, right? Fostering this place of self-examination. And I would even loop in, that's where it's really important to have like trusted colleagues or supervisors to also talk this through with and just check in on how maybe our own stuff might be influencing our willingness to have these conversations. And secondly, understanding the awareness from the client's point of view. And this is that ability to really perspective take, understand their conceptualization. Maybe it's something you wouldn't consider a concern, but for them, it's feeling really devastating. Or maybe even vice versa, and making sure we're really aligning and understanding with the client's understanding of what their sexual health looks like for them. And then we start to notice just an increased sense of freedom and comfortability with navigating sexual topics, maybe awareness of like, oh, I'm doing better at this than I thought I was. And then this kind of last step is that just general awareness of like, oh, I had kind of this new level of comfort in supporting these concerns and maybe feeling even a bit more capable of helping teach others, prompting these conversations. Yeah, it was important. And like I said, again, consultation with colleagues, seeking supervision. These are two really important components navigating this. I feel like the immediate concern is that having sexual health conversations is going to be an immediate like ethical concern. And I actually really want to push on that. We talk about, for example, suicidal ideation, risk, abuse, right? These are very ethically nuanced conversations, and yet we have those conversations regularly, maybe even multiple times a day. And so even though sexual functioning, sexual health, it can feel intimidating, I really want to assert that there are ways we can effectively introduce this information, honoring of our own selves as a human in the room too, but engage in this material in a way that is really effective for our clients. And practice, last thing, and I'll include a couple of different options throughout this presentation, and also hope these resources will be useful for you to kind of continue to practice language you're using to bring up these topics. If there's certain words that you're not familiar with or you need more education on, or even just your general comfortability of like how you're maintaining your body having these conversations. Practice, practice, practice. Great. So let's jump into some of the kind of conceptualization, templates, models. I really am hoping that you all can walk away from this presentation with like a handful of options of like ways you can initiate these conversations and feel like you have kind of a nice template you can sort of fall back on just as you're sort of finding your own therapeutic style and how you want to initiate these conversations. So first and foremost, I really want to just identify that sexual functioning is really part of this interconnected component of health for our clients, right? There is biological components, psychological components, sociocultural, interpersonal, and spiritual. All of these aspects of our clients' impact and are impacted by their sexual functioning. And so I hope none of this is brand new to you, but just as a friendly reminder, for example, a client's physical ability, illness, medication, even their neurobiology, also hormones, like all of these are factors that are going to impact their experience of their sexual health and their sexual functioning. From a psychological standpoint, mental health concerns, right? Trauma, if they've experienced trauma, whether that's sexual or non-sexual trauma, can have significant impacts on their body and how they feel like they can safely show up into sexual interactions. Also sexual shame, their own sense of confidence, and maybe even anxiety about sexual performance. These are all just a handful of these sort of psychological components that impact sexual conversations. From a social cultural standpoint, we also know that cultural values and beliefs about sex really influence and kind of work as a template for how people often approach these conversations. Also acknowledging that racism, systematic oppression, marginalization, all of these components more systemically also significantly impacts folks' feeling of safety in their body, which of course is going to impact their ability to feel safe showing up in sexual interactions with themselves or with others. And also realizing, especially if there's a lot of racist stereotypes around what sexuality looks like, for example, in a certain population, that those myths, those stereotypes might impact their comfortability with their sense of expression. Also safety and access, right? We know that there is a lot of barriers to certain populations having access to good sexual education, reproductive rights, also just safety materials, contraceptive methods. And so awareness that these systematic components are going to significantly impact folks' experience of sex. Maybe there's fear around it rather than a sense of openness or empowerment. Maybe there's just questions that haven't been answered. From an interpersonal standpoint, relationships, past relationships, current life phases. I think it's so important to acknowledge how sexual health shifts throughout the lifespan and throughout the kind of pacing of a relationship. What about when there's big job changes or kids? You have kids or family members pass. Maybe it's a multi-generational home and there's family members living with you, right? All of these components also impact a client's ability to kind of attend to and express their sexuality. And another component, spirituality, right? These spiritual and religious kind of morals and what they mean to them can really influence a client's belief about what is the meaning and the function of sexuality. And these are just, it's a super important conversation to talk through. So there's a million more reasons, but I want us to just kind of take this zoom out, holistic reference, realizing that all of these components are conversations we navigate therapeutically. And all of these are components that impact sexual health, sexual expression, right? And so I guess my hope is you hear me say, like, you know how to do this, like you have these conversations, and hopefully kind of framing it in this way makes you feel more confident in your ability to nuance these conversations. This is just a cheeky little flow chart I put together where I'm like, okay, I'll give you a lot more detailed models, but essentially like goal is just initially introduce into the intake. Like, hey, talking about sexual health and wellness is a standard part of my intake procedure. Are you comfortable with me asking you some questions, right? Like, are we just initiating the conversation? And kind of from there, if folks say, no, I don't have any specific questions, no concerns arose, okay, then the invitation would just be like, okay, I just want you to know if that ever comes up for you, that's an absolutely appropriate conversation to bring into the therapeutic space. On the other hand, if they're like, yeah, actually, maybe there's concern around arousal or satisfaction or some functional concerns or pain, then you can have more kind of follow-up questions and use one of these models. But just as like a bare bones template, I want this as just an option to kind of present some of this material. So I'd love to share just some ideas, like there's no right or wrong way to do this, but here are just some examples of ways like I have tried to initiate this conversation. And I really invite you to consider like what feels most aligned with you. And so one of mine, I just think of like intake, setting the precedent. My intent for today is to gather information about your experience. I'll also ask about topics including risk and safety, social history, sexual history and concerns, previous therapy, substance use, and more, et cetera, right? I just wove it right into the conversation I already have around my intake. So I'm kind of giving them a little teaser that is going to be something I'm going to ask about later on in the intake, so it doesn't catch them by surprise. Another one, as part of my standard intake assessment, I inquire about sexual health, wellness, and concerns. Are you currently sexually active? And then that can lead into, further conversation. And here's just a couple other examples as well. Do you have any questions or concerns about your current sexual functioning? I actually really enjoyed this. This is something Dr. Stephanie Taylor shared with me. And it's actually a fun question. I've had some clients really respond well to it. It feels kind of playful and invites a lot of conversation. When was the last time you were sexually intimate and how was it? And that just really opens the door for this conversation. So what I'd like for you to do is just take a minute and write down maybe one or two examples in your own words of how you might want to initiate or loop this into like your intake. And maybe that's just keywords, or maybe like, oh, I want to add it in here because you kind of know your template. Just take a minute to go ahead and do that. And then I think my invitation would be maybe after this presentation is to actually practice saying them out loud and notice if there's any vocal changes or if you kind of hesitate, and really just practice actually articulating the phrases. So go ahead and take a moment to just jot down some thoughts of maybe how you'd like to introduce this, when you think you might, and just have those notes. So hopefully that's something you can reference even this next week in your clinical work. Great. Okay. invite you to return to that practice and just give yourself, I think it's just one of those things where I remember when I first started clinical work, feeling really intimidated to ask about, for example, like suicidal ideation or risk, and really stumbling a lot over my words. And the irony now is like, I mean, I think about it, of course, but like, I don't think about it quite as much because now it's just such a standard part of checking in with my clients and making sure I'm doing ethical care that I forget that it used to feel really difficult to initiate that conversation. And I kind of feel that sexual health conversations are kind of the same way. It might feel a little clunky, it might feel a little awkward at first, and but with practice it does get better. And I'm a huge fan of a very like here and now interpersonal process with clients. And so I always recommend, like, you know what, there's nothing wrong with also checking in and saying like, hey, I noticed I kind of choked on that word. I'm realizing I'm worried that I might offend you or make you feel uncomfortable, but I also really want to make sure this is a safe place for you. What if we just invite the client into that process? It lets them know they don't have to do this perfectly either. And it really just incorporates a very relational dynamic to this conversation. You're right. Most people don't talk about sex in a way that isn't like joking or with a lot of slang. And so to kind of ask it straightforward might feel a little awkward at first. So this is a practice that Dr. Kirsty Spute, I'm so grateful for her mentorship and supervision as well. She shared this practice that a couple of things I just want you to think about as you are initiating these conversations and kind of figuring out the language you want to use. First is just your presence, right? What facial expressions are you using? What's your posture? If you're like slumping in the chair, not making eye contact as you talk about sex, that's definitely going to elicit to the client that this is a conversation that like is scary or not comfortable for them, right? Just being mindful. This is like going back to therapy 101, just checking in on how we're physically showing up in the room and how that might influence the client's sense of comfortability. Secondly, language, right? I always recommend using neutral language as you're talking about sex and sexual health. You don't know, it's a really important to clarify sexual orientation, pronouns, names and pronouns of their individual's partner or partners, right? Making sure that you're using kind of gender neutral language to make sure that the client can really express their experience without feeling like you're setting a template in place of who they're supposed to be sexually. And so just an invitation to be mindful of our language. And secondly, that accurate, right? I really recommend using accurate language, factual, anatomically correct language to talk about sexual health, anatomy, functioning. And if the client has a certain phrase or word they use to talk about a certain aspect of their sexuality, you could check in with them of like, hey, I noticed you're using this. I use this word. Do you want me to use the one you're using, or otherwise my default is to use this? And that can invite conversation of, is that a preferred word because it's pleasant to them, or is that a shame dynamic that maybe we need to challenge a bit more? And even just in our language, we're already working to kind of demystify and debunk sexual myths. And then lastly, our attitude, curious and open. This is a phrase I also stole from Dr. Kirsty Spute, with her permission, is that like, don't yuck someone's yum. When we're talking about sexuality and sexual health, there's a good chance that individuals are going to share things that are exciting to them, arousing to them, disgusting to them, interesting, that you may or may not align with. And that's okay. You don't have to have the same sexual interests as your clients do. They're allowed to express that in the way they want. And just a friendly invitation of like, our goal is to just be curious and help them implement safe and effective ways to be themselves. And so just a friendly reminder that like, be open, be curious. I've learned so much from my clients about people's sexual preferences and interests that I didn't even know about. And so, yeah, I just an invitation to learn. And I think that's always a space to hold with clients, is maybe they express a term or something you're not really familiar with. You can maybe even bring that into the room of like, hey, you know what? I'm realizing it's not your job to teach me, but you're sharing something that I'm not familiar with. Would you be willing to share a little bit about it? And then I'll also do some research outside of session too to make sure I'm more familiar, right? Just inviting it in. So I'm curious if folks are open to drop in the chat. Are there any, like of these three, is there any that you're feeling like maybe you want to practice or be a little bit more attentive to as you initiate sexual health conversations? Just want to open that up. Do you think you want to focus more on your presence, on language, on attitude, and not a right or wrong? Just if you want to chime in, you're welcome to drop that in the chat if you're interested in sharing. I think a big one for me is always attitude. Yeah, updated. Awesome. Yeah, making sure I'm using, this is individual in the chat said they're making sure they're using the most updated and accurate language, of course. Yeah, being curious and open without seeming unsure of how to be curious. Yeah, of course. These are great examples. Language. Yeah, I definitely feel like curious and open is a big one for me of like, hey, I want to learn and understand. And sometimes it can feel difficult as a clinician in this kind of authority role where maybe we feel like, oh, I'm supposed to be an expert in all of these things. How can I continue to be curious in a way that doesn't make the client feel like we're kind of switching our roles? Something to think about. Language, yeah, seems like a lot of folks are motivated to have more like information around language. Great. Thank you for your engagement with that. Okay. So another strategy I just want to share with you all is, and this is once again, Dr. Kirsty Spewed provided this opportunity that if you're noticing maybe certain words, maybe you like it's really hard for you to say penis or vulva or sex, like there's just words that are like, ooh, erectile dysfunction, you're having a hard time with, to actually literally make a grocery list, like 10 to 15 items, and then make another list of like 10 to 15 kind of either sex, sexual words, sexual health related words that you feel like you might kind of stumble over or feel a little bit uncomfortable sharing. And actually practice reading through that first list, reading through that second list, inviting a little bit of exploration. What emotions came up for me? Is there kind of difference in how I was able to read that? Was there, maybe I was faster with the grocery list than I was with the sexual terms? Was there any changes in my voice tone? I don't know, just inviting curiosity and openness. And the goal would be to practice that over and over until you can kind of notice that you can present those words at the same rate that you could the grocery list. Really practical strategy. And the goal here is that if we can be more confident, forthright, accurate with our language, it just does wonders for clients in reducing shame, right? Like your ability to look an individual in the eye of the other gender and say, are you having any concerns around your sexual functioning or any sense of pain, right? Like your ability to do that just can help clients so much with that shame reduction. So, and that's why a part of this is like our own work around our comfortability and accuracy of language. All right, let's jump into some models. Like I said, I really want to give you a ton of things that you can just anchor into and hopefully feel like it can be really supportive for your process. I really like this model. So this is the Plicit model. This is based off work of Annan. It's kind of an oldie, but it's a goodie. And this is from supervision with Dr. Adam Fisher. Once again, grateful for him. And he talked a lot about how our first kind of goal is permission, right? In order to develop and better understand like the issue that brought the client in, I'd like to ask you some questions about your sexual practices. And would that be all right with you, right? We're kind of bringing in the information. Even if the client chooses not to respond or not to bring up any, like, maybe they say, no, not this time, they at least have the information to know that you're a potential source, right? And that discussion could be welcomed here. And so permission is kind of asking the client's permission and also just giving the permission that the therapeutic space is a safe place to talk about sexual concerns. Limited information. Okay, so oftentimes clients can, like I said, I can't make like a super broad statement, but generally there's just a lack of information. Maybe they don't have good psychoeducation. Maybe there's a lot of kind of stereotypes coming into play that's just impacting their ability to engage in sexual behavior that's enjoyable to them. And so sometimes limited information, you're just responding and providing psychoed. And so what I mean by that is maybe, for example, I'm thinking of an individual that came to me and expressed like they weren't able to orgasm, and it really impacted their ability to feel like they could be really intimate with their partners. And they were like, man, I don't understand like what's going on. And after some more exploration, realized that they were only using either toys or body parts that were penetrative for them. And so with some more information, I was like, hey, did you know that most individuals with a vagina don't orgasm vaginally? Oftentimes we need manual stimulation, involvement of the clitoris. Like that's a really important part of facilitating an orgasm for most individuals with a vagina. And they didn't know that. They thought something was wrong with them, that they weren't able to orgasm with more like penetrative either toys or body parts. And so yeah, just providing information immediately facilitate like, oh, so you mean like me having my partner use a toy, like there's nothing wrong with that, that's what I need to orgasm. It's like, no, that's actually makes a ton of sense. So sometimes the concern is really just around limited information. They need more psychoed, just solid facts on how that maybe can impacts their functioning. Another example is an individual I was working with was having a lot of difficulty maintaining an erection. And this was an individual that had come from a very high demand religion and came out as queer. And we realized upon kind of more exploration, there was a lot of fear around their ability to kind of perform sexually. They felt like, well, I need to just be this tiger in the bedroom kind of mentality. And when we kind of slowed that down and it was like, hey, did you know that when we're feeling anxious, like from a biological standpoint, it's really difficult to maintain an erection. Like that is not where blood flow is moving when we're anxious, right? When our sympathetic nervous system is activated, its blood flow is not going to our penis. And so a lot of just psychoed around how we could reduce anxiety for them within the sexual encounter was able to help him facilitate an erection and really enjoy himself and his partner. So once again, just providing psychoeducation. I think another piece around this is I had the privilege of doing a kind of a stint of clinical work at BYU's counseling center, working within it's an LDS university, and a lot of the students there were affiliated with the LDS Church. And I had the privilege of providing some sex therapy for couples who had just gotten married, and other individuals as well. But specific to this example, it was a couple that had just gotten married, and they realized there was this kind of mentality of sex had not been accessible to them for most of their life. I felt like they weren't, it didn't align with their values to be sexually active before marriage. And so it's kind of this attitude of like, everything's off the table. And then as soon as you're married, everything's available. And this conversation with them of like, no one can just turn a ship 180 degrees overnight. There's no way. And if we have all of these messages of shutting down our sexual feelings or feeling like it's bad or it's not allowed, we're not going to be able to just immediately feel comfortable being sexual. And so providing some psychoed on like, okay, maybe we can do this a little bit more incrementally in a way that's really honoring and exploratory and respectful can help facilitate a sexual interaction that doesn't feel so upsetting to either person. So those are just some examples of where providing more information, being attuned to those dynamics can often really help facilitate and reduce sexual concern. The other piece is specific suggestions. This is where, okay, let's say, the permission, sexual concern has arisen, you've provided some more information, psychoed, and now it's like, okay, now we want to make kind of some specific suggestions. This is where it is really important to gather more data around sexual history, arousal, kind of when this concern started, and really try to understand it from that kind of biopsychosocial lens, get a timeline of the concern, and really help the client kind of understand and conceptualize what is coming up for them. And so this is where maybe you can provide more specific suggestions. So, for example, an individual had expressed difficulty with reaching orgasm. And so after kind of understanding, oh, there's no problem when you're masturbating by yourself, like that's really easy for you to orgasm, but it's difficult when we start looping in a partner. Okay, well, what do you usually like do by yourself that helps facilitate sexual arousal? We realized that if we could just kind of pull in the strategies they had been engaging with themselves into the relationship, maybe increasing foreplay, inviting maybe more manual stimulation rather than immediately jumping into more penetrative activity or other things, that we're just kind of inviting a little bit more of that time for the body to kind of warm up and become aroused. So that's kind of an example of a specific suggestion of like, oh, maybe, for example, one partner is more easily aroused and the other needs a little bit more time. So that, okay, how can we kind of recognize that and maybe create a little bit more of a balance? Excellent. And then lastly, intensive treatment. Okay, so this is where maybe you've provided psychoeducation, you've done some specific suggestions, but there's still like difficulty or maybe just the scope of the sexual concern. You're like, you know what, this is feeling kind of outside of what I feel like I can do. That's where it's maybe more intensive treatment that might be connecting them specifically with a specialized sex therapist. This might be a referral for maybe couples work. It might include, a referral, or based on your comfortability and consultation and supervision, maybe this is something that with training and some more expertise and intervention that you could provide that is a bit more specific. Great. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, so this next model I want to share with you is that this is really wonderful work from Dr. Douglas Brown Harvey. I know I shared with you, he also had published that comfort and willingness scale. That's really important as well for a reference of just the person of the psychologist and how we can maybe be attentive to those dynamics. This is a really beautiful model of just general principles of sexual health. The way I kind of like to conceptualize approaching sexual health concerns in therapy is using that implicit model that I just described to you. And then I feel like the Brown Harvey model, I kind of tuck in with that like limited information. And it's like, well, if I'm still gaining knowledge and awareness about like what is sexual health and sexual functioning, like what does that look like? This is really helpful information, both for you to know as a clinician and also to kind of use as a template with a client. So like, if you're like, well, they're describing things like maybe behavior associated with like kink or BDSM, and you're like, I don't know a ton about that. I'm trying to understand more. How do I know if this is kind of aligning with sexual health? And I think the way I actually would say, it's kind of amazing how beautiful the BDSM community incorporates these sexual health values and can be in a really consensual, meaning, empowering way. But yeah, so these are some important principles to consider. Sexual health we kind of define as like there's consent, right? It is voluntary cooperation. It is a hell yes. It is permission to reach sexual satisfaction and intimacy with oneself and with one's partners. And so I just want to say like safe consensual sex is a human right. And so incorporating that as you're talking about what sexual health looks like for your client, know that like consent is of course a really important part of that. Another piece is like non-exploitative, or it's not exploiting them. We're mindful of that sexual encounters are not power differentials or used in a way that is harming of one's or disrespectful of another individual. If, for example, maybe there's power play, those are conversations that are communicated and consented to. But broadly speaking, as a sexual goal, is that we're not taking unfair advantage of another individual. This principle is specifically important to Bron Harvey's work. He works a lot with individuals who navigate out of control sexual behavior. So maybe there's kind of a compulsory component of their sexual behavior. And so that's why this component is incorporated into the principles. Another one is honesty, right? And so are we able to communicate honestly with ourselves, with our partners, and that it is just a really safe and supportive interaction as we engage sexually. Sexual health really involves direct and honest communication. And so if we're not able to have honest conversation, both clinically in the room, but also helping our clients model that with their sexual partners, I would argue we're not helping with sexual health. It's very important to help model that. Shared values. This is an important one, is that sexual relations involving partners really involves clarifying and underlying their motives, their sexual standards, and the meaning of specific sexual acts for each person. And so it's really important to kind of prompt this conversation in the room with your client, and especially if they're involving partners, like, what does sex mean to them? Are there certain behaviors that feel meaningful? Are there other behaviors that maybe don't align or don't feel as comfortable? And just encouraging a bit more of a conversation around sexual values and how that shows up in the relationship. And then the other two pieces, right? Protection, that is that sense of safety. Are we also ensuring that we're supporting a sense of sexual health and conversation that involves their protection, involves the protection of other people, and is attuned to ways that we can be preventative of stopping STIs or unwanted pregnancy, and making sure we're facilitating that. And lastly, of course, is pleasure. That sexual health is rooted in this idea of mutual and individual pleasure. It prioritizes the giving and the receiving of pleasure, and that each moment is heightened by pleasure, can have meanings that can change over time and may be different with different partners. And so we're kind of inviting that as another important component of sexual health. So just to kind of summarize these two models, like I said, Plicit, I feel like, is a really helpful template if you're just like, I want to just start bringing sexual health into the conversation. How do I do this? This is a good like 4-step kind of way to determine, like, is this something I feel like I can help with? Or maybe is this a situation where I need to loop in another referral or get some outside help? And then Doug Bron Harvey's model is really helpful as a clinician of like, well, how do I know I'm encouraging sexual behavior that aligns with ethical standards and principles? And this is just a good template to kind of hold in mind of like, this is how we know that we're supporting and promoting interventions that are aligning with ethical standards. Oh, wonderful. Just responding to some comments in the chat. Thank you so much. Yes, a friendly reminder that we know how to do this. We have the skills to do this. We don't have to be super specialized to meet most of our clients' needs around these concerns. Yeah, there really is so much we can do by just increasing our own knowledge base, right? That accuracy in psychoed, inviting these conversations, this sense of exploration, and it's really beautiful to see what clients can, where clients go with that. So thank you for that comment in the chat. All right, so now what I'd like to do is share, I've kind of handpicked a couple of sexual like health kind of intakes, like ways you can kind of format like, oh, this is how I'm going to loop in these questions. So my hope is that you could even consider, once these slides are given to you, gosh, you could just copy and paste these, throw them on your intake, or kind of mix and match what aligns. So my hope is to kind of show you a handful. They all have similar elements, but just see kind of which one lands with you. So this was one, that was provided by Dr. Kirsty Spute. Like I said, is a wonderful supervisor I was really grateful to work with, who kind of gave this template as a brief sexual health inventory. And firstly, just starting with family of origin. What messages did you get about sex, about bodies, marriage, love when you're growing up? Kind of understanding that contextual social component. trauma. Have there been any sexual experiences that you didn't 100% want, right? We're assessing for that. Was there any situations that were exploitative or non-consensual? And we're incorporating that. Fund of knowledge. How did you learn about puberty? How did you learn about sex, contraception, consent, pleasure? We're kind of checking in on their sense of knowledge. Like, what do they know? We're inviting that in a non-judgmental way, but that helps us know as a clinician, like, maybe there's some myths here that we need to kind of debunk or attend to. And so we're kind of gathering that fund of information and also being really attentive to their experience of how sexuality was expressed to them. And this is where I think it's really beautifully from a relational standpoint, like how we can compassionately empathize or resonate, like, wow, based on what you're sharing, I could understand how, this and this and this impacts how you feel, maybe in your body. It's just important. Some other components here. Vision and values. Oh, typo there. Values is like, what's your vision for sexual health? I think this is a very client-focused question. Like, what does it mean for your clients to experience sexual health? That might look very different than what yours does as a clinician. And this is where we need to stay curious and open, what that looks like. I know there's been a lot more research and conversation, for example, around ethical non-monogamy or polyamory. And right, maybe that is part of your client's vision of sexual health. And let's hear that. Let's talk it through. What does that mean for them? What arouses them about that? What would be some boundaries around what their sexual health looks like, right? We're just being curious and open. Sexual history. This is also helpful to understand kind of their experience around like sexual debut, experiences. Were there any internalized messages, pain, their experience around masturbation, and then also partnered sexual activity. And also, I think this can be really helpful to get context around partnered activity, like, oh, this also invites a really beautiful conversation around sexual identity, sexual orientation, maybe who someone has been sexually intimate with in the past doesn't align with what is sexually arousing to or who they're attracted to now. And so some beautiful conversation of how their sexual identity has developed and hopefully become more authentic to them, and just inviting awareness. There's some really cool research by Dr. Lisa Diamond out of the University of Utah. I'm pointing because I'm in Utah and the university is generally in that direction. But she does a lot of research on how our sexual orientation and how we show up in our sexual identity can kind of shift over the lifespan. And so that can even be some really beautiful psychoed and information to provide to individuals as well. Best sex, worst sex. This invites conversation around pleasure, around what's arousing, what felt good to them, what didn't, and just really important conversations to have. And then lastly, fantasy. What sounds good to you? Even if you haven't or wouldn't try it in your real life, is there anything you're kind of curious about? What would be exciting? If they engage in masturbation, what or whom do they think about when they're doing that? Are there components that can be really helpful to understand if there's, power dynamics? Is it a certain gender, age? I will note on fantasy, this can also be an important kind of safety conversation, especially if someone expresses maybe that they're aroused by pornography of younger individuals. It would be important to clarify if that is involving vulnerable populations, such as children, for example. And I've even just said that explicitly to clients. So like, hey, I really want to have an honest conversation about what is exciting to you. And it's like I said in my informed consent at the beginning of our intake, I do have to assess, for the safety of vulnerable populations. Are you finding that your pornographic images, is that incorporating young children or individuals under 18, right? It's important to pull in those kind of ethical components. And that might not be part of it at all, but just something to note. I see someone raising their hand. If you're comfortable, you can go ahead and unmute and jump in. I do want to just share that with this being recorded, I want to just be mindful of your privacy. So if you'd prefer to save your question for the end, you're welcome to do that, or you're welcome to share, but I just want to be mindful of that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Does the protection of vulnerable populations then also include people with disabilities? Like if people are accessing
Mm.
disability porn, like where is the line with that?
Oh, that is such a good question. I'll be totally honest, off the top of my head, I'm not sure about the ethics around vulnerable populations specific to disability with porn. I'll have to look into that. But that's a really good question. Yeah. Huh. I mean, I think
Thank
uh,
you.
a component would be my understanding, especially around sexual imagery, is more to do with age. Um, but you're right. That's a where I will note it does include images as well of anatomy to help support, which is really accurate understanding. It's not designed to be a pornographic site. It is designed to be a educational site. And there's a lot of really wonderful information around anatomy and language. Indiana, they have an institute, I think it's the University of Indiana, has a whole, I think it's out of Bloomington, a whole really wonderful research program around sexual health, sexual wellness, and there's just so much good data. I included the link to their website where you can see kind of their population data over the last couple of years, and just really good, accurate information that I think would be helpful for y'all to have. Also include the Human Rights Campaign. They have a great guide on like safer sex, just really good psycho ed. You could totally just print that thing out and provide it for clients as well. But once again, factual language, just good education on preventative sex as well as pleasurable sex. And I also included Dr. Stephanie Bueller. She has a wonderful textbook that I had mentioned earlier. She also has a lot of free classes and webinars that she teaches specifically around sexual education. She's also an ASECT certified therapist and has a lot of really wonderful information to share. So I included her work on there too. So apart from awareness just around like accuracy, language, facts, I do want to share like a couple little pieces around like functioning. And so, for example, it's really helpful for folks to know that there is a difference between spontaneous and responsive arousal. There really is a spectrum of how people are either like interested and aroused by sex, and maybe the one end of the spectrum would be like asexuality, and that they're not necessarily interested in sexual encounters, whereas, you know, another end of the spectrum would be like very easily sexually aroused and very sexually interested. And so there's not a right or wrong, it's just more of a spectrum. And I always like to share with folks, there's kind of, there's a difference. Some folks feel aroused spontaneously. They could be doing something totally unrelated to sex, and something just turns them on and they're ready to go. There's nothing wrong with that. A lot more people, there's a higher percentage of folks who have more of a responsive arousal style. And what that means is they might not be thinking about sex, but man, if like the timing's right, maybe a scene pops up in a movie and it kind of like arouses them, or they see content, or maybe their partners make a move towards them that they are consenting to, that might kind of put them in an aroused space. And so that is really important kind of functioning psycho ed that I like to share with clients, especially as they're navigating with partners. It's a really common concern that folks will come in and say like, I don't understand, my partner, you know, is wanting sex more than I do. You know, how do we respond to that? And speaking to that kind of awareness of that spectrum and that spontaneous versus that responsive arousal can be really helpful. Maybe one of the partners has more of a spontaneous style and the other is more responsive. As long as there's consensual conversation around sexual behavior, there's nothing wrong with that kind of arousal discrepancy. And a lot of that can be impacted by timing. So maybe if an individual is more spontaneously aroused and their partner or partners are more responsive in their style, there might need to be some conversation around, okay, what type of foreplay or maybe playful behavior could we engage in that would kind of give you the chance to warm up, and then also check in again if this is if you're still consenting to this, if this is still something that you're wanting. I think that is a really interesting conversation to have with clients around consent and responsive arousal, and checking in with the client of what language they want to use and what communication they want to have with their partner around maybe they kind of start initiating sexual activity and decide, you know what, I'm actually really not wanting this right now. And that needs to be an important part of the conversation. Another, like I said, another really good reference is Dr. Bueller's book, which is What Every Mental Health Provider Needs to Know About Sex by Stephanie Bueller. Is a really wonderful resource as well. Okay, so those are just a couple. I feel like we kind of already attended to some of the like language, anatomy, facts. Here are some resources you can pull. I guess I'm kind of challenging you all, like read, learn. It will only benefit you. Okay. Oh, I guess my last piece on there. Yeah, I was just saying that sexuality sexual interest is a spectrum. Okay, exploration. This would be like we provided some psycho ed, and now we're kind of trying some more, like, we're kind of moving towards maybe more like specific strategies that could be helpful. And so a huge theme around this, I would say, would just be identifying, exploring internalized sexual myths, right? Like, what do they believe about the function and the meaning of sex? What beliefs do you hold about it? Have these changed over time? Right? These are the types of conversations we have with clients all the time about their beliefs and values around religion, their beliefs and values around their work, what it means to them to have a family, right? Like, I'm hoping this language isn't feeling so out of the ordinary. Hopefully it's aligning with things that, you've said and processed before. Another component is exploring what's their relationship like to giving and receiving pleasure. This is something I had shared with you. Dr. Michael Adams is a supervisor of mine and would often use this example of helping clients practice even just receiving non-sexual pleasure and practicing that. And maybe that looks like enjoying a really delicious piece of cake and really doing that mindfully and savoring it and noticing how that feels for your body and the sensations behind it, like really slowing that down, because it invites so much exploration of maybe there's barriers around giving and receiving. Maybe they're more likely to give to others, but it's really uncomfortable for them to be in a position where they receive pleasure. And so just really important conversations to be having. Another huge piece of this is our relationship to our body, right? If we experience our sexual arousal, sexual functioning in these beautiful bodies of ours, oftentimes our experience in our body, whether that's maybe chronic illness, whether that's a disability, whether that is stereotypes around size or weight that are impacting us, it's really important to explore these with our clients. And that can invite, especially for individuals who maybe navigate disordered eating, it feels really important to incorporate this piece as you're talking about sexual functioning, and can be really empowering as well. I do want to share this really cool metaphor. This is once again from Dr. Kirsty Spute. She calls it the garden metaphor. And it's this idea that on the day you're born, you're given like this little plot of rich and fertile soil. And everyone is a little bit different. But right away, our family, our culture, they all kind of start planting seeds and certain things kind of grow for us. And these might be language, attitudes, knowledge about sex, about our bodies, about safety, all these things. And as we get older, right, eventually that plot of land becomes into our care. And kind of our goal as a young adult, as an adult, is determining, okay, what are the things that I was maybe given that I want to keep? Maybe some values, beliefs around sexuality that I want to keep. Some of this beautiful roots and things I'm going to keep here. What are things that were maybe passed down to me on this plot of land that I need to uproot? I need to scrap. It is not aligning with who I am as a person, and I need to really reconsider that. And then another piece is what new things do we need to add? Maybe this was kind of the template that was given to you, what you're keeping, what you're getting rid of. And then also, but what are maybe new things that you need to add, right? It is really important. So I love this as a beautiful metaphor to kind of foster this conversation. And I'll often do that as like a therapy kind of homework exercise. Is like, what do you want to keep? What do you want to uproot? And what maybe new things do you want to add? And it can just invite a lot of really wonderful discussion around values, around what folks are hoping for. Two other resources I want to share just in regards to exploration. Dr. Emily Nagoski, she writes the book Come As You Are, which is a wonderful resource. She shares a ton about this idea of the dual control model. And it is this idea that we don't just have like gas, that's like making us aroused. We also have a brake system, and they're working actually at the same time. And so we might even be in situations that feel arousing, but are also like hitting our brakes. And she talks a lot about kind of the science behind that. And she actually created some really wonderful worksheets, which I included a QR code here that you could scan and see around how do we turn off the offs. So yes, we also want to focus on what is arousing, what lands well with us. We also want to work on reducing the things that kind of hit our brakes. Oftentimes that is like context. Maybe there's certain rooms, maybe that's certain lighting, maybe that's certain positions, maybe that's what time of day it is. Like, what are the things that kind of hit that break? And that's unique to each person. And I actually adapted that worksheet a little bit and added in, what's the gas and what's the brakes, and I included that in here as well. And these are two worksheets, or my worksheet, and then Emily Nagassi has tons more you can reference, are really great to print out and share with clients and use as a therapeutic intervention. Lastly, here's some couple just more like kind of basic interventions that you can utilize. And first and foremost, I hope this doesn't catch any of you all by surprise. Mindfulness, relaxation-based interventions. We can't feel playful unless we can feel safe. And so strategies around mindfulness, relaxation-based interventions are really supportive. So maybe that means an individual is like, hey, I'm noticing like it's really easy for me to orgasm by myself, but it's difficult for me to do that with a partner. Okay, what would it look like to maybe just have the two of you engage in this mindfulness activity together clothed? And maybe over time that could be removing clothing, of course, if that was comfortable to them, and kind of incrementally inviting an increased sense of safety, but we're modeling that in their body first. Another huge thing is just reducing anxiety. Oftentimes folks, once again, if we are in our sympathetic nervous system, it's really hard to it's hard to really be anchored in the moment. And what's tricky is that there's this balance between like arousal on one hand is exciting, but if we're kind of pushed out of our window of tolerance and it's arousing to the point that it's activating, then it's really hard for us to be present in our bodies. And so just inviting conversation around anxiety management can be really supportive. Also, if folks are expressing concerns around pelvic floor dysfunction, maybe there's a lot of pain with penetrative sex, or they're concerned about erectile dysfunction, that might warrant a follow-up with a primary care provider to check in on cardiovascular health, or other concerns. And so I always like to share that with clients as well, that just as a holistic point of care can be really important to kind of incorporate medical care as well. Another thing too, we've already kind of touched on this, like this ability to explore pleasure, both sexual and non-sexual, is a really wonderful intervention, and having folks play around with like, what's it like for you to ask for things? Maybe that's just asking for someone to grab something for you or run an errand for you. Are you willing to receive people doing things for you just for the sake of doing it for you? Right? So even though it's sexual and non-sexual, it can be really helpful to explore. Oftentimes, if folks have had kind of a painful experience around masturbation, or there's been a lot of shame around that, if it aligns with their values to engage in masturbation, it can be really helpful to kind of prescribe that as self-exploration. What would it look like for you to take time each week to put some candles on, take a nice warm shower, and like be curious about your body? And if you end up orgasming, cool. If you don't, that's okay too. But we're just kind of fostering this this new relationship with your body that's one of care and attunement rather than shame. I also included a QR code here for Sensate Focus, which is a really wonderful, it's technically designed as a couples intervention to support with anxiety reduction and just focus on like agency and pleasure and touch, is a really helpful resource. And this is kind of a common practice folks will use, and it can be really helpful. But I also have had individuals practice this as well, even on themselves, if there's kind of been this disconnect between their experience of sexuality. Also, some trauma-informed incremental exposure. There's actually really great, I'll share this resource with you all. Emily Nagassi also has a podcast, and she shares an episode about an individual who is trying to work up to being comfortable having her orgasm in front of her partner. she's comfortable doing that by herself, but not with someone else. And they talk about this kind of incremental exposure of maybe bringing, like, having them in the other room, but the door is closed. Maybe having a photo of them near you while you're engaging, like this kind of idea of sort of incrementally increasing safety. And I want to include in that, of course, from a trauma-informed lens, and it'd be really important to clarify that with the client. Okay, so I want us to talk, once again, all these interventions and things, you'll get the slides. So my hope is that you can peek at this and put these into practice and look a little bit more. So the things you can kind of reference down the line. So specific populations, I had a handful of questions come in as folks had registered for the CE about having these conversations with specific populations. And I do want to just name that this kind of overview of talking about these populations, it is limited, it is brief. And I want to acknowledge that there's so much more nuance to aligning with our client's experience and really understanding where they're coming from. And so I just want to name that first and foremost. I also want to note that research around sexuality has been very racist, quite frankly, and has focused predominantly on very heteronormative approaches to sexual health and has often marginalized individuals of different ethnic or racial or sexual orientation, gender minority. It has placed that in a camp of sexual risk or preventative measure rather than focusing on pleasure. And so I want to name that from a research standpoint, that there is limitations and there needs to be increased research on how we can have more multiculturally attuned and really affirming research supporting sexual health and wellness. So firstly, talking about how do we talk about these conversations with young adults? A couple of things that's just helpful for you to know logistically is that adolescents often get their kind of like information about sex from peers or media. And most individuals, based on some research by Shapiro and Brown in 2018, most individuals don't get good sexual education or consistent, accurate sexual education before they engage in sexual behavior. So that sucks, right? And so a really unique opportunity as a clinician is we might be that safe adult individual in their life that can provide good factual education that is preventative and supportive and honors their agency and consent. Just from a factual standpoint, about 2/3 of folks have their first kind of sexual, based on this research study, it was like a penetrative sexual experience between the ages of 15 and 20. And so it really does just elicit how important it is for us to have these conversations with our adolescents clients, because many of them have maybe already had sexual experiences or are going to, maybe even during the time that we are meeting with them. And so broaching these conversations and making sure they know we're a safe person they can talk to is really important to us reducing STI spread, making sure we're providing information about consent and agency, and reducing risk of coercive sexual encounters were a really important part of providing safe care for these folks. A couple things I want to share is like ethics and confidentiality. So we have a duty to report, right, if sexual abuse occurs to minors. And so that would be really important to share with our clients when we're doing our informed consent, making sure that we are sharing the limits and risks of our confidentiality and what we can keep private and what we can't keep private. And I also think, especially with working with parents, and if you're working with adolescents clients, I've had a rhythm of trying to loop the parent in on my informed consent and talking about limits of confidentiality and what I do have to share with them and what I don't have to share with them. And I will say that this is also unique to each state. There's some legal variability on whether or not, for example, adolescents can seek like sexual reproductive health care without parent consent, or whether or not parents have to be involved. And so my recommendation would be to do a bit more research within your own state to make sure that you're up to date on specific codes and laws there. I do also just want to note that with STI, like risk and prevention, is that young individuals account for a huge percentage of the current STIs that are around. And so our willingness to have honest reproductive health conversations with adolescents is really important to their care. I included here that like folks aged 15 to 24 account for a large portion. It's about, I have some stats over here, but it's the majority essentially of current cases. And I also want to note that especially individuals of sexual, gender, and racial minority youth are at increased rates of having undiagnosed STIs because of systematic barriers to care. And so it's really important, once again, that we're having these conversations. Okay, I wanted to share this resource with you as well, that this is from the Trans Student Education Resource. It's the Gender Unicorn. I have found this template as a really helpful way to talk to adolescents about sexual health. It kind of initiates it as more like sexual identity, gender expression, who we're attracted to, and then it can be a way to sort of kind of gently enter into that conversation around sexual health. So I included that here as well. Some more population considerations. I think especially when we're talking about sexual health within BIPOC populations, it's so important. Oh, sorry, jumped ahead. There we go. Pardon me. I think what's super important is to realize that there's so many racist stereotypes that are rooted in slavery and oppression around BIPOC individuals, bodies as objectified, as hypersexual, right? These really harmful narratives that have been rooted in, quite frankly, a lot of racist history. And so our awareness around those racist stereotypes and how that might show up for individuals is really important as we talk about sexual health. In a way, I think it's really important to do that. I think of a client I worked with, biracial individual, who really experienced a lot of she described it as being exoticized by people, and it felt very objectifying, and it really impacted her sense of feeling empowered in her body, and that also impacted her sense of feeling kind of empowered to be a sexual person. So having conversations around, how have racial stereotypes maybe impacted your ability to feel like you can safely engage in your sexuality? What does that look like for you? What are their, what aspects? I always share with clients, like, as a white woman, am I gonna, misunderstand about your experience of sexuality that would be helpful for me to know so I can best support you? And pulling in these components of race and ethnicity and being attuned to these dynamics. Okay. I'm realizing my time is running out, so I'm going to move a little bit quickly, but all of these slides will be available, and including all of the research as well, so you can continue to read and learn. Especially working with queer individuals, it's so important to realize that a lot of gender minorities, especially folks who are navigating like trans individuals, for example, as well as folks who identify as like non-binary, there is a lot of reported impacts to their sexuality and functioning. And there is, especially, we notice a lot of high rates around substance use, around rates of anxiety and depression, and increased discrimination, stigma, and violence. And so these are all increased factors that are going to, right, biopsychosocial model, it's going to impact their sense of sexual functioning. But we also know that individuals who, here we go, I got ahead of myself. There's quite a bit of research showing that individuals, especially who are trans or non-binary or gender not conforming, they're navigating sexual health concerns. A lot of that is rooted in perhaps internalized homophobia, maybe some issues around body dysmorphia, or kind of this experience in their body and their sense of feeling safe. And so our ability to, once again, address these conversations, ask what it's like to navigate, sexual health amidst hormone transition or amidst or post-surgery, is actually really attuned to niche aspects of their experience that they're probably not getting asked about anywhere else. And my invitation around these sensitive topics is always to share that and say, if there's nervousness around saying the wrong thing or offending, I kind of have this phrase with clients where I'll say, like, I realize I won't do this perfectly, but I commit to try to doing it right, like to making it right. And I found that has landed well with folks when I have misunderstood or maybe misspoke and misunderstood their experience. Another, specifically for individuals who have navigated sexual assault or sexual abuse, there was an individual who had asked specifically about military population as well, and so I wanted to include some statistics. Broadly speaking, man, there is just so much sexual trauma that occurs within the military, outside of the military. It really is, I would argue, a necessary question to ask if there have been any situations where sexual encounters have not been consensual, is really important. I think a couple things from just like a safety, trust building standpoint is that our ability to invite the conversation in, giving them a sense of choice if they want to talk about it, not talk about it, and really focusing on building trust and communicating that you are someone who they can talk this through with is really, really important. I think a huge part of working with this population as well is psychoeducation about trauma, understanding just a sense of compassion towards our body and how our body responds in traumatic situations. It's common that I've interacted with individuals who have experienced sexual arousal amidst an abuse situation, and conversation around the biology, psychoeducation around our body arousal, and understanding that our body can be aroused even in situations that we didn't consent to. That can happen, and that doesn't mean that behavior, what they did to you, was okay. And a lot of nuance and exploration around their sense of agency and consent can be a really powerful intervention. Okay. I do want to just briefly touch on the myth that folks who navigate physical disabilities or illness are not, sexually interested, and that, quite frankly, is just not true. And so I always like to share with folks that our effort to bring up these conversations with individuals is really a gesture of combating ableism and inviting that sexuality is not just one specific behavior. It is a spectrum, and there's so many creative ways that we can respond to pleasure, enjoyment, and inviting that into the conversation can be really, really empowering for folks, especially who maybe have grief or have experienced so much pain with their bodies. So yeah, I think just recommendations around that would be emphasis on reducing pain and increasing pleasure. Honest conversation around what type of behavior feels accessible and safe, and really inviting creativity and playfulness in sexual expression that is honoring of their experience. And I think this can just be a really playful conversation of how we can show up in sexual relationship as we're navigating disabilities. I did include a couple little interventions here as well to consider. And just kind of a brief thoughts as well, specifically working with religious populations where sometimes it can feel like, oh man, how do we talk about sex in a way that doesn't impact or offend their spiritual heritage? I think a huge part of this, once again, is clarifying our role as provide psychoeducation. And I've shared this with clients and say, look, I want you to know I'm not going to convince you to set aside your beliefs. I don't want to challenge what is important to you, but my role within my field is to provide good science, good facts. And so I am going to provide psychoeducation from a neutral, non-religious standpoint. How would that sound for you? Is that something you're comfortable with? And presenting it more that way can be really, really helpful. And a huge theme would be also around reducing shame and just increasing a sense of congruence. So is there some conversation around just normalizing what it means to be a sexual human, and perhaps pursuing behavior that can be aligning of their sexual interests, but also aligning with their moral values and beliefs And I will say that is way easier said than done. It is so nuanced, but a really important conversation to have, and it is doable. And I think this is a friendly reminder that it's not our job, once again, to decide what sexual health and wellness looks like for our clients. Ultimately, that is their decision. And so they might decide to have standards or expectations that are different than what you would want or what feels comfortable for you. And that's where it is, difficult as a clinician to hold that space. But ultimately, we want to give them that agency. I did include a couple interventions here as well that could be helpful specifically with this population. And lastly, I will just name, especially with the work of Dr. Esmiel Wilson. She's a wonderful sex therapist out of Canada who talks a lot about beautiful ways of kind of incorporating spirituality into sexual behavior by maybe even incorporating prayer or meditation, or imagining, what does God think about you as a sexual person, can be a really meaningful way to attend to these themes. Okay, well, I'm going to just share our slide up here before we jump into the Q&A. So like I said, I have a handful of resources here, but Jen is helping me out by also making like a big kind of master list of resources also that will be accessible as you scan that QR code. And as well as hopefully the slides themselves will continue to provide lots of resources that you can scan, reference, and read from. So I do want to just share before we jump into the Q&A is that we have some upcoming events that I want to share with you. First, we have our next CE by Dr. Shelley Welty and Tammy Clouston on May 17th. It is a ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, latest research, mechanisms, and best practices. This is another CE that we will be providing through our center. And then we also are providing a larger kind of training. It's a full training certification as well as CE options around peers, which is out of the UCLA Peers Clinic, which focuses on evidence-based strategies for supporting neurodivergent young adults. Really meaningful training that we'll be providing in person and online. So I want to share that with you in early June. And we have exciting details with Dr. Stephanie Taylor, who is a supervisor of mine that I'm so grateful for. She is doing kind of a more in-depth conversation around sexual health, around pleasure, sexual health intervention, and it's called Pleasure as Healing, and it will be our CE event for June, and we'll get the details for that soon. So I recommend pulling up our website, and you can either attend for free and just learn more information, or CE credits, and we would love to have you here. So wonderful. What I'm going to do is I want to thank anybody that needs to run at 12 o'clock. Thank you for being here. I will we'll pause the recorded section of this presentation and we'll move into Q&A. And what I will invite is that I'm going to peek at the chat first so I can try to answer some of those questions. And then I'll open it up to invite other questions within these last couple minutes. So thank you so much for those of you for joining, for your insight, your engagement, and for willingness to have this conversation. And if you have some time to stick around, we'll do an unrecorded Q&A. And feel free to email me if you have any other questions as well. Oh, excellent. Great question around how do we not exclude marginalized people who identify as asexual, aromantic. Imagine this is where it's helpful to confirm orientation and start the conversation really broad. Yeah, actually, I'm so glad you brought this up. Yes, I would say that even just firstly starting with our language, oftentimes I'll share with folks before I even start talking about sexual health is like, hey, I want you to know like sexuality is really a spectrum. Some folks are like really interested in sex. It's a really important part of their life. And for others, it's not quite as important. And so kind of inviting that as a broader spectrum can feel a little bit more supportive. There's actually a really wonderful book by Angela Chen. It's called ACE, and she just came out with it pretty recently. And it's a really, really wonderful book about asexuality and also just kind of challenges the stereotypes we have around sex. And so I recommend that apart from just supporting ace or aromantic clients. So I think a couple things that would be important with considering those folks is just making sure that we're normalizing that sex is, like I said, that spectrum. Like there's nothing wrong with them if that isn't something that's really important to them. And I think a question I often get for folks is like, well, how do I differentiate if someone is maybe navigating being asexual or aromantic, or are they maybe navigating like some type of I want to be really careful how I say this, maybe navigating like a dysfunction, for example, maybe some type of aversion or something. Maybe that's trauma related, maybe that's something else. And I think a big component there is checking in on where the client is at. Like, is there a lack of interest in sexuality or lack of interest in having a relationship in that way? Is that creating distress for them? If it is, then it would be worth some more exploration of like, is that distress because we think we should be that way, or because it's actually something they really want and feel like there's barriers to, right? It can kind of invite more conversation around the cultural components and maybe the myths we receive around sexuality. But in theory, if there's opportunity for them to explore maybe what it would mean to not be asexual, to maybe not explore their sexuality in that way, we can also identify, well, what are ways that you can attend your sexuality that maybe isn't the standard sex behavior? Maybe is that how you show up with your clothes? Is that your tattoos? Is that the way you carry yourself down the street? There's a lot of ways that we can attend to this conversation around sexuality and sexual expression that doesn't need to limit folks who maybe don't want to engage in that behavior specifically. Yeah, great question. Okay, another question. How to help a female client engage in sexual intimacy after cancer recovery? Has a desire to be intimate but struggles to feel aroused. Yeah, this is a wonderful question. I think a couple things I would want to start with is first exploring maybe like what sexual functioning and sexual arousal looked like for her prior to cancer, and maybe creating some space to process grief around the transition of maybe what was accessible to her body then, and maybe what shifts or changes are occurring for her now. And being attentive to the grief in that, I think would be really, really important before any specific gestures, like how to then increase intimacy. So let's say there's been attentiveness, grief, processing around that. I do feel like it would be meaningful maybe even to try that. For example, the gas or breaks worksheet, that gas section specifically. What are the things that are arousing to her? Is there any type of like touch or sensation or behavior that is really meaningful or arousing for her? And could we invite kind of small incrementally incorporate that? And so maybe that looks like, is she able to enjoy even just like getting a massage and really anchoring into her feeling that as a sense of pleasure and enjoying that? Could she invite a partner into maybe providing either manual stimulation or a massage, something that kind of invites partner touch? Can she kind of anchor into that? I think that would be my encouragement, would be to start kind of an incremental component. I would also just be curious from a medical standpoint, given like where the cancer was impacting her body, might have a say in her body's capacity for experiencing arousal. For example, was it cancer involving some of her organs, right? Her reproductive organs, impacting her vagina, her vulva, her ovaries, right? Like if it's specific to that, there might also be some more important like medical conversations needing to happen about like what arousal is available to her if the cancer has impacted that part of her body. Yeah, wonderful questions. Great. Any other questions? Thank you so much. Wonderful involvement in the chat. Questions, thoughts, recommendations. It's so fun to get everybody together and crowdsource ideas too. Great. Well, thank you everybody for your engagement and for joining. I really hope this can just, even if you walk away with like one other thing you can do to make these conversations more accessible, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. I just have had so many clients tell me like, oh, you know what? I've been to therapists before and I've never talked about this, or I'm really glad you asked. Now that I think about it, it really impacts me in this way. And so I really hope it will just create a sense of connection and attunement to your clients and really helping you provide holistic, affirming, and attuned care. So thank you all so much. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll do my best to respond to those promptly. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.